Greetings, everybody, and welcome to week number 8. I realize that it's not quite Halloween yet, but I'm a person who loves to celebrate holidays of all kinds. And since I'm not actually doing a video for the week of Halloween, I wanted to sort of celebrate early. So I have on my Halloween shirt. Yes. Now, if we were really in the classroom, I would also probably be wearing my Halloween socks and Halloween earrings and all things Halloween. I love holidays. I even like to celebrate holidays that aren't necessarily part of my own tradition. My husband says that if Secretary's Day had decorations, I would probably have them out all over the house, and he's correct. I'm known on the Strawberry Plains campus for decorating my office very lavishly for all holidays, so I miss that. And I miss interacting with you in person, so just a little Halloween cheer there. Today I want to talk to you first off about the research paper guidelines, because as you know, we have a big research paper in this class that makes up a pretty good chunk of your final grade. So I want to discuss that with you. And then also I want to talk to you about that brief overview of early 20th century prose and then the intro to modernism documents as well today. So let's begin with the research paper guidelines. And if you want to follow along with me, go to content up at the top of our course page and then look for research paper guidelines and materials and then research paper guidelines. And note too that in that section there are all sorts of good, helpful things there. There are the English department grading standards. There's the grading rubric for this paper. There are some MLA informative papers like MLA Picky. There's the peer review sheet for the research paper, the idea worksheet for it. There's proofreading marks and abbreviation sheet, and this sheet obviously, and the TBR learning outcomes that are being evaluated in the grading of this paper. There are also, and this is going to be most helpful to you, there are 3 sample papers, and they are all examples of A-level research papers from past semesters, and so I think that you'll find that to be particularly helpful. But let's go back to the research paper guidelines. So for this paper, you will submit a well-researched essay exploring in depth an American text. It could be either a poem or a fictional piece that is representative of one of the time periods and genres that we're studying this semester. So it might be representative of realism, local color realism, naturalism, African American literature of the late 19th, early 20th century. It might be early 20th century poetry. It might be imagism. It might be early 20th century prose. It could be drama of the 20th century. It could be Harlem Renaissance writings, later 20th century prose, or later 20th century poetry. Now you may, if you wish, choose readings that are listed on our class syllabus that we are reading together as your chosen text. Alternatively, you can choose a text that's not listed on our syllabus if there's something that you prefer to write about. The choice is yours, but you must choose a text written by an American author, because this is modern American lit, within the time period of this class. So from 1865 to right now, and that's a wide chunk of time. So it has to be an American author, American text, between 1865 and now. So here are the important dates. Week 9, that's Monday the 19th through Sunday the 25th of October, we'll be holding an idea workshop for the research paper. And I will have an idea worksheet for you that will ask you some tentative questions, and it sort of begins the brainstorming process and the research process for this paper. So to get there, again, you would do the same thing that you are doing to get to this paper. You go to content, research paper materials, and then click on Idea Worksheet for the research paper to read the worksheet questions. And then you click on Assignments and Idea Worksheet to submit your answers. And you want to do that before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, the 25th, and I'll provide you with some feedback. Then week 10, that's the 26th of October through the 1st of November, I'll ask you to upload a copy of a rough draft in progress of the research paper. You must do this before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 1st. So to do that, you would go to Assignments up at the top of our Brightspace course page, and then look for rough draft of the research paper. Aim for at least 2 pages, double space, Times New Roman 12-point font, right? If you submit anything less than 2 pages, it's difficult for me to give you very much feedback. So aim for at least 2 pages. And obviously, if you can write more than that, the more you submit, the more feedback you can receive. So I will get back to you with my comments within that document during your individual conference in week 11, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But here's something very important to remember about that rough draft. I will deduct 10 points from your research paper grade if you do not upload a rough draft before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, the 1st of November. So you'll instantly lose 10 points off of your research paper grade, which would mean that the highest grade that you could earn if you earned a perfect A would then be a 90, which is a B+. So don't do that to yourself. Be sure and submit the rough draft. I allow you to do that so that I can give you feedback before the final draft is due. So it's for your benefit that we do it. And then the next thing you want to do is sign up for an individual conference, and that'll be held during week 11. That's all we're doing during week 11 in this class. And we'll hold those individual conferences either through Teams or through Zoom, depending on your preference. I can do either one. And so to sign up, I have the link there where you can go and sign up, and there are instructions there. There are time frames open on Monday through Friday of that week. I will not be conferencing that Saturday or Sunday, but I can do Monday through Friday. Then week 11, which is Monday the 2nd through Friday the 6th, that's when we'll actually be holding those conferences, and virtually, obviously. So you want to have the latest draft of your paper with you. You want to have it in front of you when we conference so that you can ask questions and receive feedback. And I will also have comments on the rough draft that you uploaded. If you've written more, obviously, between the time you upload that rough draft and the time of your conference, you want to have it in front of you. And it probably would be a good idea to send the new writing to me as well just before your conference. So note that if you miss your conference, I will count you absent for that entire week. If the time slots offered on that sign-up sheet do not work with your schedule, send me an email and let me know, and we'll either arrange another time or we'll simply correspond via email in place of a virtual conference. The 15th of November, which is a Sunday, that's the day that the final draft of the research paper is due, and you'll submit it via the Assignments tab. So you'll go to Assignments and look for Research Paper. Remember, 10 points are deducted from that research paper grade for every calendar day that it is late. That includes the day that it's due and weekends, and I do not accept papers after 5 days. So make sure, again, that you don't let that happen to you, because it will cause your grade in the class to seriously suffer, since this assignment makes up a pretty good chunk of your grade. So the specifics: the final draft of the research paper should be at least 4 full pages in length. If it's less than that, points will be deducted. You can certainly go over that, so it might be 6 pages long. They need to be full pages, typed, double-spaced in Times New Roman 12-point font with standard margins. Do not type them in another font. Do not type them in a larger font. They have to be Times New Roman 12 point. And please use MLA in-text citation and a separate works cited page at the end of your paper. Your paper needs to contain a total of 4 reliable sources, 4 of them. One of those sources will be the text that you are analyzing, that you're writing about. At least 2 of those 4 sources have to consist of a scholarly book or article that you need to search for. And I would strongly advise that you look for critical analysis of your chosen text. The remaining sources can be non-traditional, so maybe a documentary, a film about this text or something related, a newspaper article. It could be an interview with the author. Be sure to incorporate the quotes, don't drop them from your sources, and back up your claims. So the objective is to conduct research focused on the rhetorical and contextual analysis of a specific text that is representative of one of our time periods and genres that we're studying this semester. So what does that mean, rhetorical analysis? If you think back to 1010, hopefully your instructor taught you a bit of rhetoric. And rhetoric is a fancy word that means effective communication. And hopefully your instructor in 1010 taught you about Aristotle's 3 rhetorical appeals: ethos, logos, and pathos. So you might look to see, is there ethos in this text? Is there pathos, emotion? Is there logos, logic? And ethos is a Greek word that refers to the credibility, the trustworthiness of the author. So it depends on what kind of text you're analyzing in terms of whether you're going to see all of those 3, ethos, logos, and pathos. The other thing you're looking for in a rhetorical analysis that is more applicable to a literary analysis would be the rhetorical techniques. So not the 3 appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos, but the techniques. Let me make that more clear. If you were writing about a piece like Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address, you could analyze ethos, logos, and pathos, because that's a different sort of piece, right? That's from a speech that he made. But if you're analyzing a short story or a poem, you're not going to so much look for the appeals, but you're going to look for the techniques. Things like metaphor, simile, alliteration, symbolism, things of that nature, imagery. So that's the rhetorical part of the analysis, the techniques that the writer is using. And then the contextual part, I tell my 1010 students, think of context like an atmosphere that surrounds every communication in the world, right? So here's the example that I give them. If I were to have stood up in Mobile, Alabama in 1850 and proclaimed all people should be treated equally, regardless of their color, and slavery should be abolished, I would not have been received well, right? Because of the context of those times. If I had stood up in Mobile, Alabama in 1960 and made that proclamation, I would not have been received well. Hopefully, fingers crossed and prayers said, if I stood up in Mobile, Alabama right now and made that sort of announcement, people would say, yes, you go, girl, you preach it, right? So that's context. What is going on in that particular time and place, in that moment in American history? And so that's the other part of the analysis. So if you're writing about a piece like Desiree's Baby, the context of that piece, the setting of it, is the antebellum South. So you're going to be thinking about the social mores of that time, right? The norms of that time as you're writing. So your paper needs to explore and offer an answer to the following 4 inquiry questions. So at some point in your paper, you need to answer these questions and address them. What particular time period or genre does your text represent? What elements within your chosen work clue you into the fact that it's representative of either realism or naturalism or imagism or whatever it is? So don't just say, well, I know that this was realism because it was written in whatever year, right? Explain to me what about that text lets you know that it's realism. Why do you know that it's realism? Okay, maybe it's presenting life as it actually is. Maybe it's focusing on average middle class people. That's what realism did. Maybe it's overly sentimental or nostalgic. Those were some of the weaknesses of realism, right? So you let me know how and why it is representative of that genre. What are the author's main messages and themes? What rhetorical techniques are at work? So maybe, again, metaphor, simile. Maybe it's free verse rather than rhymed verse if it's a poem. Why does this particular text have meaning? How does it help make us more conscious, perhaps, of certain philosophical ideas? Now, that question may not apply to all texts, but if it's an example of naturalism, like Stephen Crane's War is Kind, it would apply here because it's showing that idea, that philosophical idea of determinism. If you turn 18 and you're male and there's a war going on, it's goodbye to you, buddy. Sorry, but that's naturalism for you. Heredity and the environment dictate what happens to you, and you're just a helpless victim of the universe. Sorry, right? So perhaps it makes us conscious of free will. So maybe it is realism, and it's showing that people have a choice. Maybe it makes us conscious of political or ideological values like equality, freedom of speech, etc. So to conduct a successful paper, you need to consider the following things, and your paper should contain the following: a clear, identifiable thesis statement. So look back at part 2 of the midterm because the same ideas apply here. It's just a longer paper. So you want an introductory paragraph that introduces the reader to this text that you're analyzing. You want to tell us who the writer is. You want to start broadly with a hook that makes us want to keep reading and narrow into your thesis. And your thesis should be the last sentence of your introductory paragraph. So it needs to be clear and identifiable. Through a thoughtful analysis of a New England nun, one may see that this text is representative of local color realism and presents a theme of blah, 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 right? You want paragraphs that contain clear topic sentences. So your first sentence of each paragraph is called a topic sentence. You want that topic sentence to let your reader know what this paragraph that's just beginning is going to focus upon. And sometimes the topic sentences are like a connector in a chain, a link in a chain. They might look back to what you just said in the previous paragraph while pointing ahead to what you're about to say in the current paragraph. You want to make sure you have a minimum of 4 sources. If you have more than that, that's fine. You must have 4. One of them is the text you're writing about. 2 of them have to be scholarly. What does that mean? Think back to English 1010. That means they must be peer-reviewed, right? So they must be either articles or books that you're accessing from Pellissippi's library website that are peer-reviewed by other scholars. And then you need quotations and or paraphrases from those sources, from all 4 of them, within the body of your paper that support your points and that are cited in MLA formatting. So you have your quote. Afterward, in parentheses, you have the author's last name and the page number or the line number if it's a poem. And then that separate works cited sheet. So choose a text that especially interests you, and the quality of your writing will reflect, as I said before, your interest in that text. And also look at those examples of A papers because you'll see some good ones there. Now let's take a moment to go back to the table of contents and to go to course documents, and then you're going to look for that overview of early 20th century prose. And let's see. Gotta find it here. Early 20th century prose overview. All right, there it is. So I'm going to, as I talk through this, tell you what ideas might come back and haunt you on the final exam. So prose and fiction and nonfiction, and we know that fiction is work that is not true to life, right? And nonfiction is true. Of the American colonies, so before we were actually a nation, and the United States, written in the English language from about 1600 to now, really captures our quest to understand and define who we are as Americans. So from the beginning, we were unique in the diversity of our inhabitants. We had people coming into our midst from all over the place. Over time, they arrived from all parts of the world. And English quickly, obviously, became the language of the United States, but regional and ethnic dialects have enlivened and enriched our literature almost from the start. And we see the use of that vernacular, again, in local color realism. Today, American prose encompasses a variety of traditions and voices that share a lot of common context, and the big one being the geographical region now known as the U.S. Native American lit, that was largely oral at the time of colonial settlement, stands apart as a separate tradition that is within itself strong and interesting. So if you ever get a chance to take a class in Native American literature, do it, because it is quite fascinating. So for the first 200 years, our writing reflected the settlement and the growth of the colonies, largely through histories, religious writings, expedition and travel narratives, that sort of thing at first. Biography played an important role, especially in our search for native heroes, because think about it, we were a brand new sort of ragtag group of folks, and we didn't really have an identity there for a while. We didn't have a hero. We didn't have icons. We didn't have an idea exactly of who we were just yet. So fiction only appeared after the colonies gained independence, and there was this clamor, this need for a uniquely American sort of literature, and it brought forth novels based on events from our past, and we didn't have much of one. Remember, we were a new country. So there was a flowering of prose in the mid-1800s, and we began to find our voice. And by then, fiction had become the dominant literary genre in America. But in the 20th century, though, American literature took its place on the world stage, and it began to really exert influence on other literatures throughout the world. So that's sort of a background of how it all began and where it's all kind of headed. So now we get to modernism, the 1900s. So during the 20th century, and remember, keep your centuries straight. Right now we're in the 21st century, but the year isn't 2120, it's 2020. And the last century was the 20th century, but it was the 1900s. So during the 20th century, a communications revolution came about. All of a sudden, we had motion pictures, we had radio, we had television. It brought the whole world into view, and eventually right into our living rooms. Now, I have heard my parents talk about before there was television, that people would sit out on their porches a lot more, and that you knew your neighbors a lot more because people weren't inside their houses glued to their television sets. And so the way that they gained information and knowledge and sort of interacted with others was through actual face-to-face interaction. And we are losing that, sadly, a lot nowadays. And so think, too, about the 1960s, the time of the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of the reason why the terrible things, the atrocities that were happening finally came to the attention of other parts of the United States was because of television, because television cameras captured what was happening during the peaceful protest of Dr. King and his followers, when these peaceful people were being attacked brutally and beaten and hauled off to jail, and so the fact that there was television brought that into the living rooms of people all over America and all over the world. And that helped Dr. King's cause tremendously. So these new forms of communication competed with books, though, in the 20th century as our sources of amusement and enlightenment. Because before, again, you couldn't go to the movies, you didn't have television, you didn't have radio. And so the book was the way that you learned about the world and the way that you were sort of entertained. New forms of transportation made our society increasingly mobile and familiar with other regions of the country and eventually of the world. So suddenly, literary voices from even the most remote corner could reach a national audience, right? And at the same time, American writers, and especially American fiction writers, began to influence world literature. So the 20th century saw the emergence of a genre called modernism. And here's the main thing that you want to remember about modernism on a quiz and on the final exam. Modernism responded to the world's complexity by asserting the idea that the individual, one person, had the potential to achieve a broader perspective than that offered by any one society or its history. That's the line that you want to remember about modernism. So we have this increasingly complex world. In certain ways, it's become easier on us because we have a lot of modern conveniences that make our lives easier. But by the same token, it's becoming more and more complicated. Families are being spread apart now, right? Because our society is increasingly mobile. And so you might have relatives with whom you had been close before who are now way off on the other side of the country. And the world wars happened in the 20th century. And the atomic bomb was dropped in the 20th century. And so suddenly we saw that one person who is very evil, like an Adolf Hitler, for example, might have the power to do really evil things to the entire world. And by the same token, one person who is a good person might have the power to bring goodness to the whole world. And one person can now, because of all these modernized modes of transportation and communication, develop an understanding about the world that that person couldn't have developed before. So that's what we mean in that statement. So realism and naturalism and regionalism, that local color realism, were still viable genres, viable modes of expression, but they too were reflecting this increasingly complex reality of 20th century society. And again, immigration, industrialization, urbanization, all those things that led to the rise of realism and then naturalism, and in turn class stratification, all sort of work together, continuing into the 20th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, American writers were struggling to convince the world that we had any history, right? But by the 20th century, American authors, like European authors, had to grapple with more than enough history. So in the 1900s, in the 20th century, there was a really cool genre called psychological realism, and I just want to briefly introduce you to it. This won't ever be on a quiz probably, but it's good for you to know about it because it is fascinating. Henry James was a key figure in the transition from the 19th into the 20th centuries, and more of his novels were published actually before 1900 than after. But his style really characterized that psychological rather than a physical kind of realism. And his themes seemed a long way away from 19th century American literature. And his use of American and European subject matter and perspectives, as well as his sense of the complexity of both individual and cultural history, make him a modernist and a writer that the 20th century claims more so than the 19th century. And then Edith Wharton, she was a very interesting writer. Her works show the influence of James. She was another key turn of the century figure there, and a lot of her novels are taking place among the wealthy and the worldly elite in New York City. And they focus on the restrictions imposed on individuals by social definition and convention. So we often think, oh wow, if I just was rich and I had tons of money, everything would be great, right? But Edith Wharton shows us that the rich have their own issues and problems that uniquely happen to people when they have wealth and power. So, an interesting take. We also saw social realism and naturalism, as we've said before, happening in the 1900s. So, James and Wharton were examining that sometimes complex psychology of the rich and powerful, but other writers were turning to the psychological and physical realities of the working class. And the ranks of those people were continuing to swell with more and more immigration happening in the late 19th, early 20th centuries into our country. So several American authors who were sometimes known as social realists looked at working conditions, often for the purpose of social reform. And remember, we talked about this before when we talked about realism. So a good example is in 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, and that novel actually exposed the unsanitary, miserable working conditions in the stockyards in Chicago. So the book led to an investigation by the federal government and the subsequent passage of the Pure Food Laws. So interestingly, we've talked about before how American literature and American history go hand in hand and feed off of each other. And here's a palpable instance where a book actually led to social change and led to the making of history. So, as the popularity of social realism implied, the reading audience of the U.S. had changed as social and economic realities changed. And immigrant populations added a lot of variety to our 20th century American fiction. So you've heard of the Roaring Twenties, right? The 1920s, also called the Lost Generation. So after World War I and that pandemic of 1918, very much like what we're going through now, hit, there was this period sort of disillusionment and cynicism. And it found expression in the writings of a group of Americans who were living abroad in Paris, and they became known as the Lost Generation. So they never really formed a cohesive literary movement, but the people associated with the Lost Generation shared a bitterness about the war, sort of a sense of rootlessness, of dissatisfaction with American society. And the most influential writers of that generation include people like Ernest Hemingway and Fitzgerald, Wilder, McLeish, and Crane. And that term was first used by Gertrude Stein in her preface to Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises. So then we come to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Excuse me. So the glitter and the excess of the Jazz Age ended with that 1929 stock market crash. And I have heard my father, who was a little boy at the time, talk about that. And he said that in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the soup lines would extend for blocks. So people lost everything. Middle class people, wealthy people, everybody lost everything. To the degree that the banks, if you had a mortgage, they would just say to you, well, just stay in your house because we're in trouble too. So don't worry about paying your mortgage right now. Just stay in your house, take care of it, good luck. And so this was just an unbelievable time in our history, and it ushered in that so-called angry decade of the 1930s. A lot of novels of the 30s echoed the despair of the Great Depression. And during the Depression, though, this is a cool thing. There was this federal agency that was established. It was first known as the Works Progress Administration, and then later the name was changed to the Works Progress Administration initially, pardon me, and later changed to the Works Projects Administration. So always the WPA, but the middle name there in the acronym changed. So it was created to help put Americans to work on public projects at a time when so many people were out of work. And one arm of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project, and it ran from 1935 to 1941. It employed writers to produce things like travel guides, local histories, nature studies, things like that. And it produced a lot of interesting material and provided training ground for some of our best writers, including Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and Miss Zora Neale Hurston, whose works we're going to read when we get to the Harlem Renaissance. And so some of these writers were employed to come down into the South and to interview the remaining former slaves, because by this time the people who had been slaves formerly were very old now and they were dying out, sadly. And so one of the arms of this project was to send down these writers with very crude audio equipment to actually record these people and document their experiences. And you can go online and you can actually hear these people, the voices of these former slaves, telling you their experiences firsthand. It is incredible. If you ever get the chance to do it, I believe the site is called something like Unchained Voices, but it is absolutely just riveting. It's really, really, really cool. So that's an overview of 20th century prose, and I've told you there sort of the parts of that document that could kind of come back to haunt you a little bit. Let's look too very quickly now at that introduction to modernism, and it's found in the same section. So we've kind of defined it already. It's notoriously difficult to define the term clearly because it encompasses this huge variety of artistic and philosophical movements that include symbolism, futurism, surrealism, imagism, Dada. Some of these are movements in art that I'm really not that familiar with. If any of you are art majors, maybe you are. But to further complicate things, a lot of the modernists, including some of the most successful and famous ones, weren't affiliated with any of those groups. So it's difficult to pin it down, but there are some basic tenets of the modernist period that apply in one way or another to all of the movements and to all of the writers. So modernist literature is characterized chiefly by a rejection of 19th century traditions and of their consensus between author and reader. So specifically, the modernists tried to break away from the conventions of writing and of art in the Victorian era. And that separation from 19th century literary and artistic principles is a major part of their broader goal. Modernists wanted to distinguish themselves virtually from the whole history of art and literature, and that's kind of hard to do. Ezra Pound kind of captured the essence of modernism with his famous dictum, "Make it new." But the problem with that is that pretty much every story that could be told has already been told in some form or another. And so in order to create something brand spanking new, these writers often had to try using new forms of writing. So this period of modernism produces a lot of experimental and avant-garde styles. And best known for that experimentation are people like Virginia Woolf, Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Pound, whose works we're reading. So when did modernism happen? Well, the dates become problematic since there is no sense of a singular or consolidated movement, right? But the beginning of the 20th century is a good starting point for modernism. So that's emboldened there if you're following along on the document. Remember that. That can haunt you later on. So the beginning of the 20th century is a good starting point for modernism. It saw the end of Queen Victoria's reign. It marked the break between the 19th and 20th centuries. And it also roughly coincides with the publication of several groundbreaking theories, like Freud's interpretation of dreams and Einstein's theory of special relativity. So there were real shifts, in other words, at that point, not just symbolic change, going on in the natural sciences, the social sciences, the liberal arts. And so using that year 1900, though, is also kind of problematic because it excludes some writers from the late 1800s, which definitely display modernist tendencies. So a lot of scholars use the year 1890 as a starting point because it's close to the end of Victoria's reign and the end of the century, but it's still fairly inclusive. So while 1890 is an entirely appropriate starting date, it's also kind of an artificial one. So if you were to say on a quiz the beginning of the 20th century, 1900 or 1890, I would accept either one as the starting time for modernism. By convention and convenience, most scholars use 1945 as the end point for modernism. So that date marks the end of World War II. It marks a momentous shift in world politics as well. And so 1900 to 1945, 1890, 1945, that's really the period of modernism. So just a little bit more here on the modernist aesthetic. The goal of accomplishing something which, artistically speaking, had never been done before is often, ironically enough, and as you might guess, accompanied by a sense of despair. Well, duh. Due to the inherent difficulty and apparent impossibility of achieving the goal. Right? So that despair coincides with a changing worldview that filters through a lot of British and American society, European society. While the pre-modernist world is characterized by this sense of order and stability, rooted in sort of a meaningful nature of religious faith, collective shared social values, this clear sense of identity, both personal and cultural. The modernist period, and you want to remember this emboldened section here, is characterized by a sense of chaotic instability, and it's rooted in the revelation that collective social values might not be particularly meaningful, leading to faithlessness, skepticism, confused sense of identity. Why? Again, because of World War I and World War II. The dropping of the atomic bomb, all of the increasing complexity of the world that's going on. So this worldview is prominent in much, though certainly not all, modernist literature, but perhaps most famously in the fragmented verse of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And I'm an Eliot fan, but I am not going to torture you by making you read The Wasteland, because I don't like it. Shh. Don't tell anybody. But it's not my thing. I'm like, T.S. Eliot, you wrote all this other stuff that I love. What happened when you wrote The Wasteland? What on earth? I've had students who've read it just because they wanted to see what it was like, but no Wasteland in this class. Sorry, Wasteland lovers. Alrighty. So that's an overview. Hopefully it's been helpful to you. Have a great rest of your week.